Hi everyone, welcome back. This is Dr. Hall. We're going to start lecture 2, which is all about how we end up with the body parts that we have. So in terms of human development, this lecture is going to be talking about how we end up with our biologic sex, those body parts, hormones, chromosomes that make up that category. So before we get started, yes, so part A, we're going to focus just on genetics and chromosomal sex. And let's do a little review from last time. So we talked about all the different ways that you can define the word sex and gender and sexuality. So as you'll remember, when we talk about sex, we could be talking about this behavior people engage in, we could be talking about a method of reproduction, or we could be talking about your biologic sex or biologic gender, all those body parts that we're going to talk about today. When we talk about gender, again, we might be talking about body parts, or we could talk about gender identity, your internal sense of self, or gender expression, which is how you communicate gender to the world. Sexuality could again be referring to those behaviors or to your desires, right? Not necessarily what do you do, but what do you want to do, right? So today we're going to focus specifically on how we end up with our biologic gender. Here's a review slide for you if you wanted to take a moment to pause and go through. And again, the other diagram that we use to kind of show those overlapping concepts. Okay, so let's get going on the new stuff, genetics and chromosomal sex. So this looks like a little gummy bear or some kind of cute little alien, but in fact, this is how we all start out. So this is an image, a recreation of what a 6-week-old human embryo looks like. So 6 weeks after conception, this is what we all look like. And so since we're going to be talking about how we end up with our body parts, let's take a closer look in at what is between those legs and underneath that tail, which will go away, by the way. Obviously, we're not born with it. Look at that. So in this particular embryo, this is what we see as the external genitalia. So I ask you to take a moment and say, could this be a baby picture of me or not, right? So think about it. Could that have been you? The answer is yes. So the answer is that all of us start out looking exactly the same. We all start out with exactly the same body parts on the outside. You cannot tell by looking at a 6-week embryo if it's going to grow up and develop into a little girl or a little boy from a biologic sex perspective. You just can't know by looking at it. So we give names to everything in biology. So here's a diagram of those same external structures. So you can see this kind of knobby part up top is called the genital tubercle. A tubercle means like a little bump. Then we have on the side the labioscrotal swelling. I bet you can't tell what's going to happen with those. Inside those we have the genital folds, and then this innermost part here is called the urogenital sinus. So those are the different parts of the external genitalia of a 6-week embryo. And we call this the indifferent external genitalia because it's not different between somebody that's going to grow up to be male-bodied and somebody that's going to grow up to be female-bodied. Okay, so we start out with this indifferent external genitalia. What about on the inside? Do things look different on the inside? If I had a special ultrasound or x-ray, took a look inside of a 6-week embryo, what would I see inside? So there's kind of a faraway view. Let me close up for you. And this is what I would see inside, whether it was an embryo that was destined to become male-bodied or female-bodied. So internally, we are also indifferent at 6 weeks of development. So we have a couple of interesting structures here. So we have gonads, which are these round things, one on each side. And those are going to eventually likely turn into either ovaries or testicles or testes. Those two words are used interchangeably for extra confusion. I also am going to have 2 sets of tubes. One set of tubes, shown here in the pink, are the Mullerian ducts, And then there's another set of tubes shown in blue, which are the Wolffian ducts, right? See that right there? That's the Wolffian duct. So we all start off with this kind of double set of tubes, and I'm sure you can't guess what the pink and blue color coding is going to end up being, right? Okay, so we look exactly the same both on the inside and the outside at 6 weeks of fetal development. So here it is, everything all together for your review, right? So for the first 6 weeks, we all look exactly the same, no difference in anatomy whatsoever. So you got to be saying to yourself, well, something has to be different, right? Because they're going to develop differently. So what is different? Did you guess it? Your chromosomes, right? Your genes. That's what's going to be different. So in people, most of the time, if you're going to develop as a typical male, your sex chromosomes, as they're often called, are going to be XY. Whereas if you're going to develop as female most of the time, you have XX. So what's different is your chromosomes. What's different is your genes. So let's talk about what chromosomes are for a minute. All right, so chromosomes is this word that we use to refer to how we package up our genetic material, which is our DNA. So in humans, we have a total of 46 chromosomes, but they're arranged in 23 pairs. So you see here, you've got number 1. Let me circle that for you. Chromosome number 1 here. And we have 2 chromosome number 1s. So, and each chromosome, whether it's a chromosome number 1, chromosome number 2, chromosome number 3, is going to be where we'll find certain genes. And genes are instructions for how to build all the different parts of a human, right? And so we have 2 copies of chromosome number 1. So, and these are resources of information of how to do things, right? So it's almost like, you know, pairs of shoes where you have a left and a right of each one. Same thing with chromosomes. Or sometimes I like to think of it like textbooks. So I have 2 different anatomy and physiology textbooks here in my hand, right? They both have the same kind of information, but there are some slight differences between them. And the interesting thing about human genetics is that sometimes the information in one chromosome on the gene in one of the chromosomes will override the other one. For example, having brown eyes. If you have one chromosome that says you're supposed to have brown eyes and the other one says you're supposed to have blue, that brown one is going to be dominant. It's going to override. Other times they work together, right? So kind of like a textbook too, right? So in terms of how curly or straight your hair is, that's different genes working together. Skin tone, different genes on the different chromosomes working together. So chromosomes are packets of our genetic material or our DNA, right? So I'm going to use those 2 words interchangeably because genes are made out of DNA, so the language gets weird. All right, so that's what chromosomes are. So here's all that information in text if you want to pause or go back and review it. Okay. All right. So where did your chromosomes come from, right? They had to come from somewhere, and it wasn't a stork or anything like that. So the moment that you got your chromosomes, right here. So as soon as sperm penetrates through the egg and fertilizes the egg, that is the moment when your chromosomes are set for life. The way that works is the sperm arrives with a half set of chromosomes. The sperm comes to the scene with 1 chromosome number 1, 1 chromosome number 2, 1 chromosome number 3. You get the picture, right? So we call that haploid. It has 1 of each, but not the other shoe in the pair of shoes, right? So it's got a half set of all the different chromosomes, and the egg is also haploid, has a half set. So when those 2 half sets come together, you have a full set, which we call diploid, and that fertilized egg is called a zygote. So this is a really big moment because fertilization is the moment at which your genetic destiny is set in stone. So this moment where whatever chromosomes happen to be in that particular sperm combined with whatever chromosomes are in this egg, boom, those are your chromosomes for life. So we have the two haploid gametes, sperm and egg, coming together to form a diploid zygote that now has 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs. There's that information if you need to stop and take notes and check your work. So those chromosomes and those 46 chromosomes in that one single cell, that one zygote, is then going to go on to form the entire baby, right? So that one cell is then going to make copies of itself millions and millions of times over, and using the genetic information in those 46 chromosomes from that sperm and that egg that came together, create all of the characteristics that led to you being who you are today from a biologic and genetic standpoint, obviously. So it's pretty cool how that all happens. So let's talk specifically now about chromosomal sex. So we're going to kind of focus in on just that one pair of chromosomes, the sex chromosomes, the 23rd pair. So as we mentioned, they're determined at fertilization. So as soon as sperm meets egg, right, then whatever sex chromosomes you have them then at that moment. So you're going to have either XY or XX in most cases. There are always exceptions. So let's learn a little bit more about those two chromosomes, helpfully color-coded for you here, right? So X and Y. The X chromosome is actually one of the largest human chromosomes. It contains a ton of genes on it, so it has lots of really important information that is necessary for human life. In fact, there are no humans on this planet who do not have an X chromosome. You have to have an X chromosome. You cannot be a living, breathing human without all of that genetic information that is present on the X chromosome. So everybody you meet, everybody you see has at least one X chromosome because you can't live without it. So it has a lot of genes. Red-green color vision is on it, which is why color blindness is more common in male-bodied people because they only have one copy of this chromosome. So if that gene is a little wonky, they don't have a backup copy. There are also important genes for blood clotting, without which you cannot survive, and many, many more things. Interestingly, although we call it a sex chromosome, the X chromosome itself doesn't have any genes on it that have much to do at all with sexual development or reproduction. It has a few little things, but for the most part, eh. All right, so what about the Y chromosome? So the Y chromosome, unlike the X, is the smallest chromosome that humans have, and it's not necessary for life. There is no genetic information on it that you absolutely must have in order to be a human being. Obviously, because about half the human beings walking around on this planet do not have one, right? So this one is just like extra stuff, extra accessories, bling. And it only has about a dozen or so genes, right? It can't have a lot of important stuff on it. But some of those genes are really important for male development, as you might imagine. So one of them is called SRY gene, and that stands for sex determining region of the Y chromosome. And so if that gene is present, it's going to tell your gonads to become testes or testicles. So that's a very powerful gene, right? So it's just one little gene, but it has a huge impact on your development, as we'll do later in the lecture. There are some other genes on the Y chromosome which tell your body how to make sperm. That process is called spermatogenesis. Genesis means creation, so creation of sperm, how to make sperm. And then there's some other genes that tend to make you a little bit taller. So stature is how tall you are. Also how big your teeth are. Male-bodied people with the Y chromosome tend to have slightly larger teeth. And how big your hands and feet are, right? So male-bodied people, even if you take somebody who's of the same height or general overall body size, their hands and feet will tend to be bigger than a female-bodied person that's otherwise of the same body size. So some kind of interesting things there. So one final thing to think about when we think about chromosomal sex is, where did you get those sex chromosomes from? So the thing about eggs and sperm is when our bodies make them, so when a female-bodied person makes eggs or when a male-bodied person makes sperm, when you're creating those chromosomes to put into the sperm and egg, you can only make copies of chromosomes that you already have. So in a female-bodied person, if they're XX chromosomes, which is typical female, the only chromosome they can put into that egg is an X. They can't put a Y into an egg because they don't have one to copy to put in there, right? But a male-bodied person typically has X and Y. So when they make sperm, usually about half of them are going to have an X chromosome as one of their 23, and about half of them are going to have a Y chromosome. So the point here is that it ends up being the sperm, by virtue of having an X versus a Y, that determines the chromosomal sex of the zygote and then later the baby. So I had an image of him in our last lecture. Here again is Henry VIII, and you might have figured out by now that I've included him in this slide because he's kind of famously known for chopping off the heads of lots of his wives or banishing them or divorcing them, in large part because they didn't give him a male heir. Right? He needed a son to carry on and to inherit the throne after him. So Catherine of Aragon only gave him a girl, so she got banished to a nunnery. Anne Boleyn only gave him a girl, Elizabeth, so off with her head. Then, oh, I can't keep them all in order. Jane Seymour did give him a boy, but he died young. And then there was Kitty Howard, and then there was Catherine Parr. So it went on and on. But so it wasn't their fault, right? It's all about the sperm. The sperm is what determines the chromosomal sex of the zygote, because the egg is always going to bring an X. It's only the sperm that can bring either the X or the Y. And there's that information there for you. All right, so in summary, we all start out as this indifferent stage. We all have the exact same body parts for about the first 6 weeks of development after conception, after fertilization. So externally, we have that little knob, the genital tubercle, the genital folds, the labioscrotal swelling, and that little urogenital sinus or urethral slit in the middle. Internally, we have these gonads and 2 sets of tubes, Mullerian ducts and Wolffian ducts. Chromosomes are packets, ways that we organize our DNA. We have 2 copies of numbers 1 through 23, making a total of 46. We got half of those, 1 of each number from a sperm and half from an egg, and all our chromosomes are determined at the moment of fertilization. So chromosomal sex, typically XX or XY, gotta have an X. And the Y, small but mighty, right? It has that SRY gene, which we're going to see is going to be pretty powerful. And it has some other genes for making sperm, having bigger hands, feet, and teeth, and being a little bit taller. And so remember, a sperm can give you an X or a Y, but the egg can only give an X. So chromosomal sex is determined by which sex chromosome is being carried by the sperm. All right, that's it for the first part of this lecture, and in part 2B, we'll talk about how typical males develop.